The worst part about waking up inside a novel was not discovering that I was cursed, mute, and doomed. It was realizing the villain could hear every single thought I was desperately trying to keep to myself. I figured that out while kneeling in the middle of Emperor Damien Blackwood's throne room. 3 days earlier, I had been Noah Bennett, an ordinary guy who stayed up too late finishing a fantasy novel with an ending I hated. Now I was Noah Bennett in name only, trapped inside the body of the novel's forgotten Omega, a minor character remembered for exactly 2 things. A mysterious curse that stole his voice and an ending nobody bothered to mourn. And according to my memory of the story, this meeting was where everything started going wrong. I kept my eyes lowered as footsteps crossed the polished marble toward me. Damien Blackwood, the Alpha Emperor, the tyrant readers were supposed to fear. Even without looking up, I could feel the entire room change when he approached. Nobody spoke. Nobody seemed willing to breathe too loudly. Great. Of every character in the entire novel, I had somehow landed directly in front of the one man I absolutely needed to avoid. I tried swallowing, but my throat felt strangely empty. The curse was real. I had tested it repeatedly since waking here. I could breathe. I could cough. I could make the faintest meaningless sound if I tried hard enough, but actual words refused to come. That was particularly inconvenient when the man standing 10 feet away supposedly had the patience of a thunderstorm. "Look at me," Damien said. His voice was calm, which somehow made me more nervous. I slowly raised my head. That was my first real look at him. Dark hair, sharp gray eyes, immaculate black formal clothing, and an expression so controlled that I could not guess what he was thinking. He looked exactly like the novel described him, except descriptions on a page had failed to capture how intimidating it felt when those gray eyes were focused entirely on me. "This is ridiculous," I complained silently. Of course, I transmigrated into the one character who cannot even explain himself. Damien's expression changed. Barely. His eyes narrowed as though he had heard something unexpected. I froze. "No. Impossible." I had not spoken. I physically could not speak. Damien took another step closer. "You were brought here because several people believe you have information I need." "Wonderful. And how exactly am I supposed to give you information? Interpretive dance?" His eyebrow twitched. My heart nearly stopped. That was coincidence. It had to be. I carefully kept my face blank. Damien studied me for several long seconds before dismissing everyone else with a quiet command. Soon the enormous chamber was empty except for us. That did not improve the situation. If anything, it made every tiny sound feel louder. Damien stopped a few feet in front of me. "They told me your curse prevents you from speaking. Finally, someone did their homework. Then I will not require you to speak." My eyes snapped toward his. "Wait, what?" Damien held my gaze with an unreadable expression. "You do not need to explain yourself." Every thought in my head disappeared at once. Those were almost exactly the words I had wished someone would understand since waking in this world. Damien turned as if the conversation were finished, but I stared after him, suddenly forgetting everything I knew about the original story. One terrifying possibility settled into my mind. There was only one way to test it, so I thought the most unnecessary thing I could manage. "Your throne is ridiculously uncomfortable looking." Damien stopped walking. Slowly, very slowly, he looked back at me. "It is." My stomach dropped. I had never said a word. Damien Blackwood had answered me anyway. For several seconds, I could only stare at Damien while my brain tried to invent an explanation that did not involve the Alpha Emperor secretly listening to my thoughts. Maybe he had guessed. Maybe the throne really was uncomfortable. Maybe I was panicking over 2 coincidences. Damien turned toward the doors, apparently satisfied with leaving me confused. Absolutely not. If he could hear me, I needed to know before my thoughts accidentally revealed that I knew his entire future. I followed him into a long corridor where tall windows overlooked the palace gardens. Damien walked ahead of me while 2 attendants remained several feet behind. "Fine. One more test." I looked at the heavy black coat covering his shoulders. "That coat looks unnecessarily warm." Damien continued walking. Nothing happened. Relief loosened the knot in my chest. See? Coincidence. Then Damien stopped beside an attendant. Have the West Wing fireplaces reduced this afternoon? The palace is too warm. I nearly walked into him. He glanced back. His expression remained perfectly calm. I narrowed my eyes. Clever. That could still be coincidence. I needed something specific. Something nobody could reasonably guess. A servant approached carrying a tray with tea and small pastries. Damien took a cup and gestured for me to do the same. I chose a pastry, took one bite, and immediately regretted it. This is the driest thing I have ever eaten. I need water just looking at it. Damien slowly lowered his cup. Bring him something else. The servant looked surprised. Your Majesty? And water. My hand froze halfway to the tray. Damien continued drinking his tea as if nothing unusual had happened. I stared at him. He ignored me. All right, now I was offended. If you can hear me, at least have the decency to admit it. The corner of his mouth moved. Barely. Was that almost a smile? No. The terrifying tyrant from the novel did not smile because a cursed Omega complained about pastries. I decided on one final test. Damien resumed walking, and I followed until we reached a wide staircase. I focused on the back of his head and formed the most ridiculous thought possible. Emperor Damien Blackwood has terrible taste in curtains. He stopped immediately. My eyes widened. Damien turned toward a nearby attendant. Replace the curtains in the West Wing. The attendant blinked. All of them, Your Majesty? Damien looked directly at me. Apparently, they are terrible. I almost dropped the glass of water in my hand. There was no possibility left. He could hear me. Every sarcastic comment. Every nervous complaint. Possibly every thought I had experienced since entering the throne room. My stomach twisted when another realization followed. If he could hear the harmless thoughts, what else had he heard? Had he heard me call this place a novel? Had he heard me thinking about the future? About his supposed ending? Damien dismissed the attendants and waited until they were out of sight. Then he stepped closer, leaving a respectful distance between us. You look frightened. I stared at him. Because you are reading my mind. I am not reading your mind. My breath caught. Damien's gray eyes softened with something I could not identify. I only hear what you direct toward me. That was somehow worse. How long? I thought carefully. Damien was silent for a moment. Since you entered the throne room. Relief hit me so quickly that I nearly laughed. Then Damien added, although I am beginning to suspect there are things you are trying very hard not to think about. My relief vanished. He turned and continued down the corridor. I remained where I was, watching him leave, because I had just discovered two problems. Damien could hear my silent complaints, and now the most dangerous man in the novel knew I was hiding something. The dangerous part was not that Damien could hear me. The dangerous part was that I knew something was supposed to happen tomorrow, and keeping it out of my thoughts became nearly impossible. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a guest room in the West Wing, staring at a writing desk while trying to remember the exact sequence from the novel. Tomorrow morning, Damien was supposed to approve Lord Everett Caldwell's proposal to transfer control of the Northern Grain Reserves. It sounded harmless. In the original story, it was treated like a minor political decision, barely worth a page. 3 chapters later, shortages spread through several northern towns because the shipments were redirected. The disaster damaged Damien's reputation, strengthened Caldwell's influence, and became one of the first reasons people began calling Damien a tyrant. I knew all of that. Damien did not. More importantly, I had no proof. I could not walk into an imperial meeting and announce that I knew the future because I had read it in a book. I could not announce anything at all. By sunrise, I had convinced myself to stay away from Damien until the meeting ended. That plan lasted approximately 12 minutes. An attendant arrived with a written invitation requesting my presence at breakfast. Of course he wants breakfast now. Apparently terrifying emperors do not understand personal space. When I entered the private dining room, Damien was already reading several documents beside a plate of untouched food. He looked up once. Good morning, Noah. I stopped. Nobody here had called me Noah so casually before. I sat across from him and concentrated intensely on a bowl of fruit. Do not think about Caldwell. Do not think about grain. Do not think about the northern provinces. Damien turned a page. You are unusually quiet. I stared at him in disbelief. I am always quiet. I am literally cursed. His mouth almost curved again. You know what I mean. I grabbed an apple simply to give my hands something to do. Then I noticed the document beside his elbow. At the top was Caldwell's name. My stomach tightened. Damien noticed. Something wrong. No, absolutely nothing. Please sign the terrible document that ruins everything. I am sure that will go wonderfully. His hand stopped above the page. I closed my eyes. Brilliant. Noah. Truly subtle. Ruins what? Damien asked. I looked at him sharply. He had heard enough. There was no point pretending anymore. The northern grain reserves cannot be transferred to Caldwell. Damien's expression became serious. Why? Because the shipments will disappear from the official routes within weeks. Several towns will receive less than half of what they were promised, and Caldwell will blame your administration. Silence filled the room. Damien did not accuse me of lying. He did not demand an explanation. He simply studied me for several seconds. How certain are you? Completely. That answer frightened me because it revealed too much confidence. Damien looked back at the document. Then he folded it closed. The proposal will not be approved. I stared at him. That was it? No interrogación? No suspicion? You are changing an imperial decision because of one silent warning from someone you met yesterday. Yes. That is a terrible leadership strategy. Possibly. Then why are you doing it? Damien met my eyes. Because you were afraid for people you have never met. Not for yourself. I had no sarcastic response to that. Later that morning, Caldwell's proposal was officially delayed pending an independent review. By noon, palace officials discovered discrepancies in the shipping records attached to it. I stood beside a window reading the written report twice, hardly believing what I was seeing. This had never happened in the novel. Damien had approved the proposal. The shortages had followed. His reputation had suffered exactly as Caldwell intended. But now none of that was happening. One complaint from me had changed the sequence. One decision from Damien had erased an entire future I remembered. I looked across the room at him. Damien was watching me instead of the report. You expected something different, he said quietly. My pulse quickened. Yes. Something that has not happened yet. I said nothing even inside my head. Damien did not press me. He simply returned his attention to the documents. But I could no longer pretend my presence here was harmless. The story I remembered was already changing, and Damien Blackwood, the man who was supposed to become its villain, had just trusted me enough to change it. By the end of that week, I had learned something far more confusing than the fact that Damien trusted my warnings. The Alpha Emperor described by the novel and the man I followed through the palace seemed like two entirely different people. The book had called him cold, impatient, and impossible to approach. Yet when an elderly clerk accidentally brought the wrong financial report to a morning meeting, Damien simply pointed out the mistake and gave him time to retrieve the correct one. When a young servant spilled tea near his documents, Damien asked whether the servant had burned his hand before worrying about the papers. None of this matched what I remembered. Either the novel had exaggerated everything, or I had misunderstood Damien from the beginning. That possibility bothered me more than I wanted to admit. It became harder to maintain my distance from him because Damien had apparently decided that my silent commentary was useful. He began requesting my presence during meetings, meals, and afternoon reviews. Nobody understood why a mute Omega with no official position suddenly spent hours near the Emperor. I did not understand it either. One afternoon, I sat across from Damien in his study while he reviewed tax reports. I had been there nearly 2 hours, and my back was beginning to complain about the beautiful but deeply uncomfortable chair. Whoever designed palace furniture clearly hated the human spine. Damien kept reading. 5 minutes later, an attendant entered carrying a cushioned chair. I stared at it, then at Damien. What? He asked without looking up. You know exactly what. I have no idea what you mean. Liar. His mouth curved slightly. I moved to the new chair anyway. The following morning, breakfast included the soft honey bread I had liked 2 days earlier. At lunch, the overly sweet tea disappeared and was replaced with the lighter blend I preferred. When the west wing became cold after sunset, extra firewood appeared in my room before I could complain. None of those things were dramatic, but that was precisely why they unsettled me. Damien noticed details the novel had never bothered to give him. Worse, I was starting to notice details about him too. He skipped meals when he worked too long. He rubbed his left temple when reports frustrated him. He always thanked servants quietly when they brought documents late at night. He disliked unnecessary ceremony and seemed happiest during the rare moments when nobody expected him to behave like an emperor. This is becoming a problem, I thought one evening while watching him work. Damien looked up. What is? You are not acting like the villain. His expression became unreadable. I immediately regretted the thought. Damien set down his pen. Is that what you believe I am? My chest tightened. I looked away. That was what the story said. The thought escaped before I could stop it. Damien became completely still. I realized what I had done only after the silence stretched too long. The story. 2 words I should never have allowed him to hear. I stood quickly, but Damien did not call the guards or demand answers. He only watched me with those calm gray eyes. Noah. I hesitated. You have been waiting for me to become someone you already decided I was. I slowly looked back at him. I did not decide it. Then who did? I could not answer. Damien studied my face before leaning back in his chair. You warned me about Caldwell before evidence existed. You react to decisions before they are made. Sometimes you look at this palace as if you recognize it, and other times as if you have never seen anything like it. My pulse became painfully fast. He had noticed far too much. Damien continued quietly. Whatever you know, I will not force it from you. Why? The question escaped immediately. His expression softened. Because trust obtained through fear is not trust. Something inside me shifted. The tyrant in the novel would never have said that. I stared at him, wondering how much of the story I remembered had ever been true. Damien returned to his papers and I thought, almost without meaning to, maybe the book was wrong about you. His pen stopped. For one brief second, his eyes met mine with unmistakable recognition. Then he said very softly, perhaps the book was wrong. My entire body went still. I had never told Damien there was a book. For the first time since waking in this world, I forgot about the curse, the future, and every terrible ending I remembered. There was only one thought left in my head. Damien knew. I stared at him across the study while he calmly returned to his paperwork, as if mentioning a book he should know nothing about was perfectly ordinary. You heard that before, did you not? Damien did not look up. Yes. My stomach sank. How much? His pen stopped. Enough. That was not an answer. It is the answer you are getting until you sit down. I realized I was still standing beside my chair. I sat mostly because my knees suddenly felt unreliable. Damien closed the document in front of him. You think of this place as a story. You remember events before they occur. You sometimes refer to an original ending. And you repeatedly wonder why I am different from the man you expected. Every sentence made my pulse climb. I had spent days trying not to reveal exactly those things. Apparently, my mind had betrayed me whenever I was tired, distracted, or frightened. Then you know I am not the Noah who belonged here. Damien's expression remained steady. I suspected. Since when? The second morning. I nearly choked on absolutely nothing. The second morning? You have known almost the entire time? Suspected, he corrected. That distinction does not make this better. A faint trace of amusement appeared in his eyes, and somehow that irritated me enough to overcome my fear. Why did you not expose me? Why did you let me stay near you? Why did you trust my warning about Caldwell? Damien listened until my thoughts finally ran out of momentum. Then he answered only one question. Because you never asked me for anything. I frowned. You knew about the grain reserves, Yet your first concern was for people in the north. You knew information that could have earned you influence, yet you tried to avoid me. You believed I was dangerous, yet you still warned me." He paused. "Those are strange choices for someone intending to deceive me." I looked down at my hands. In the novel, Damien trusted almost nobody. His court was filled with alliances built on obligation, reputation, and fear. Yet here he was explaining why he had chosen to trust the one person who technically did not belong in his world. "You should be more suspicious of me." "Probably. I could be dangerous. You complained for 20 minutes yesterday because the library organized history books by color. That was objectively ridiculous." "I agree." I looked up, and Damien was smiling. Not the tiny, almost smile I had caught before. A real one. It changed his entire face, and for one embarrassing second my thoughts simply stopped. "Oh, that is unfair." His smile faded into confusion. "What is?" "Nothing. Absolutely nothing." Damien raised an eyebrow but allowed me the lie. The silence that followed felt different from the ones before. Less like something empty and more like something shared. I reached for the small writing pad kept near my chair and wrote the question I did not trust myself to think. Why accept me instead of the person who was here before? Damien read it carefully. His expression softened. "Because I never knew that person." He looked directly at me. "The person standing before me now is the one I chose to trust." My fingers tightened around the pencil. Nobody in this world had said anything that made me feel more real. For days, I had thought of myself as an intruder borrowing someone else's place in a story. Damien was the first person who looked at me and saw Noah, not a replacement. Then his gaze shifted toward the writing pad. "There is one thing I want to know." My chest tightened again. Damien leaned back, giving me space rather than demanding an answer. "In the ending you remember, what happens to me?" I froze, because that was the one question I had been desperately hoping he would never ask. I stared at Damien for so long that the clock on the mantel suddenly seemed unbearably loud. He had asked the one question I could not answer without changing everything between us. In the ending I remembered, Damien lost his throne after the Empire turned against him. The book described it as justice for a tyrant, but now that I knew him, those words felt wrong. Worse, I had begun to understand how carefully someone had constructed that ending. Caldwell had been only one piece. I lowered my eyes and reached for the writing pad. "The ending is bad," I wrote. Damien read the sentence without reacting. "For me?" I nodded. "For you." My hand stopped. I barely remembered what happened to the original Omega. He disappeared from the story before Damien's final downfall, mentioned only in a sentence explaining that his curse had worsened. I wrote, "I do not know." Damien looked more troubled by that answer than by his own future. "Then we change both." I almost laughed. "You say that like changing fate is an administrative task. Most impossible problems become less impressive once someone puts them on a schedule." That was such a Damien answer that I actually smiled. 2 days later, he took me to the oldest section of the Imperial Library. He had ordered researchers to investigate my curse without revealing why. We spent hours among shelves containing records older than the palace itself. Near sunset, I found a narrow leather volume cataloging magical bonds, associated with imperial bloodlines. One passage made my hands turn cold. A silencing curse could be paired with a receptive bond, allowing one chosen person to hear thoughts the cursed individual could no longer speak. Damien read over my shoulder. "Chosen person," he repeated. "That means this connection was designed." "It appears so. Then my curse and your ability to hear me are the same spell." Damien's expression hardened with concentration. We searched deeper. Another record described the purpose of such bonds. They had once been used to protect rulers when ordinary communication could be intercepted. The cursed person became a silent witness, capable of sending thoughts to one specific member of the royal line. But the practice had supposedly disappeared generations ago. I turned another page and found a handwritten note in the margin. "The bond does not awaken through blood alone. It requires a mind not anchored to the world in which the curse was created." I read it twice. Damien did too. My heartbeat accelerated. A mind not anchored to this world. There was no reasonable way to misunderstand that. This was not merely a curse waiting for any omega. It required someone like me. Someone who came from somewhere else. I backed away from the table. I thought arriving here had been an accident. Damien watched me carefully. Perhaps it was not. The idea made the entire room feel smaller. If my arrival was intentional, then somebody had known another world existed. Somebody had known I could enter this body. And somebody had prepared a curse that connected me specifically to Damien. He stepped closer but stopped several feet away, leaving the choice to me. Noah, look at me. I did. Whatever brought you here does not get to decide what you become here. The fear in my chest eased slightly. You always have a convenient emperor speech ready. I practice. Despite everything, I smiled. Then I noticed something tucked inside the back cover of the book. A folded sheet of paper much newer than the surrounding pages. Damien carefully opened it. There was only one sentence written across the center. When the silent mind reaches the alpha air, the final sequence will begin. My smile disappeared. Damien looked at me. I remembered the novel's ending, the events that had destroyed his reputation, and the strange certainty that fate was already moving around us. The curse had not been created simply to silence me. It had been waiting for me to reach Damien. For the next 3 days, Damien treated the mysterious note like a problem that could be solved with enough records, enough questions, and apparently very little sleep. I treated it like proof that my life had been arranged by someone who knew far too much. Neither approach made me feel better. Then the story began repeating itself. The first sign arrived during breakfast when an official reported that several provincial governors had requested an emergency council meeting. I recognized the event immediately. In the novel, that meeting had happened shortly before public confidence in Damien collapsed. The circumstances were different now, but the timing was almost exact. My appetite disappeared. Damien noticed before I could hide it. You recognize this. Unfortunately, was it supposed to happen? Something like it. Damien dismissed the official and waited until we were alone. I reached for the writing pad. We changed Caldwell's plan. This meeting should not be happening anymore. Damien read my words twice. Then perhaps the events are not fixed, only the outcome they are trying to reach. That possibility had already occurred to me, and I hated it. Over the following 48 hours, more familiar pieces returned in unfamiliar forms. A trade dispute replaced the grain shortage. A disagreement between ministers replaced Caldwell's political maneuvering. Rumors about Damien's leadership appeared despite the fact that he had avoided every mistake the original story blamed on him. It felt as though the world was correcting itself whenever we stepped away from the path I remembered. The final sequence. The phrase from the hidden note would not leave my mind. What if that was exactly what it meant? The curse had activated when I reached Damien, and now the story was trying to force its ending back into place. We returned to the old library and searched until midnight. Near the bottom of a locked archive cabinet, Damien found another record describing the bond. Breaking the sequence required the silent witness to reject the role assigned to him. I read the sentence again and again. Beneath it was a warning. Doing so could permanently seal the witness's voice. Damien reached for the page, but I closed the book first. No. I know what I have to do. You know what you think you have to do. If rejecting the role breaks the sequence, then I can stop the ending. Damien's expression became cold in a way I had rarely seen. At the cost of your voice, I already cannot speak. That does not make losing the possibility acceptable. If it keeps you from the ending I remember, it is worth it. Damien stood so quickly that his chair scraped against the floor. No, I stared at him. You do not get to decide that. Neither do you. It is my curse. And it is my future you are attempting to purchase with yours. His voice remained controlled, but emotion had broken through the calmness he usually wore like armor. I had never seen him angry because of something that might happen to me. Damien stepped closer, then stopped, respecting the same invisible boundary he always did. Listen to me, Noah. You do not get to decide that your life is worth less than mine. The words struck harder than I expected. I looked down because meeting his eyes suddenly felt impossible. I am not saying it is worth less. Then stop offering pieces of yourself as if they are expendable. I could not answer. Damien lowered his voice. We change the ending together or we find another way. Those are the choices. You are very controlling for someone who claims to respect my decisions. And you are very argumentative for someone who cannot speak. I looked up in outrage. Damien almost smiled, but the moment passed quickly. Then bells began ringing somewhere beyond the library. Not alarm bells, council bells. Damien turned toward the windows. My stomach dropped. In the original story, those bells had marked the beginning of the final political crisis. They were not supposed to ring for another month. The sequence was accelerating. Damien looked back at me. Stay with me. I nodded, but one thought remained carefully buried where I hoped he could not hear it. If there was only one way to break the ending, I already knew what choice I would make. The council bells kept ringing as Damien and I hurried from the library, but by the time we reached the main corridor, I already knew the story was moving faster than either of us could control. Officials filled the halls carrying reports from every province, and each new message sounded painfully familiar. Trade agreements were being questioned. Governors were demanding explanations. Old rumors about Damien had returned despite everything he had done differently. It was not the same chain of events I remembered, but it was leading toward the same destination. Damien spent the next several hours meeting with his council while I remained beside him, listening and watching. This time he did not make the decisions the novel expected. He opened the financial records to independent review, ordered the disputed trade agreements temporarily suspended, and gave the provincial representatives direct access to the evidence they had requested. Every choice removed another reason for the empire to distrust him. By midnight, the crisis had begun to settle. It should have felt like victory. Instead, the mark of my curse, a faint silver pattern around my throat that I had almost forgotten existed, suddenly grew warm. I touched it instinctively. Damien noticed immediately. Noah, I am fine. That thought has never once convinced me. Normally, I would have complained about his impossible ability to detect every lie I told myself, but another wave of warmth passed through the mark. Then I understood. The sequence was failing. We had changed too much. Whatever force had been pushing events toward the original ending could no longer reach Damien through politics. So the curse was demanding its final condition. I remembered the archive record. The silent witness had to reject the role assigned to him. Damien heard the realization at the same moment I had it. No, I looked at him. There might not be another way. We agreed to find one. We agreed to try. His expression tightened. Noah, if I keep accepting the role this curse created for me, the sequence continues. I have spent this entire time reacting to a story somebody else wrote. Maybe rejecting it means I stop letting that story decide who I am. Damien stepped closer. And if you lose your voice permanently, then it will finally be my choice. He stared at me, and for once I could not tell what he was thinking. I closed my eyes and focused on the strange connection that had existed between us since the throne room. I had always assumed it belonged to the curse. Now I understood the curse had only built the bridge. Everything we had shared across it had been ours. I formed one clear thought, not for the spell, not for the story, but for myself. I reject the ending chosen for me. The warmth around my throat vanished instantly. So did everything else. I opened my eyes. Damien was staring at me. Can you hear me? He did not respond. My heart stumbled. Damien? Nothing. For the first time since we met, my thoughts reached only me. Damien's face changed as understanding settled between us. I cannot hear you. The words should have been reassuring. The sequence was broken. Instead, the silence felt enormous. I reached for the writing pad with unsteady hands and wrote. It worked. Damien read it, but there was no relief in his expression. Your voice. I tried to speak. Nothing came. Not even the faint sound I had managed before. I wrote, gone. Damien closed his eyes for a moment. When he looked at me again, the The regret there hurt more than the silence. I quickly wrote another sentence. I chose this. I know. Then why do you look like that? Damien read the question and gave a tired, almost helpless smile. Because knowing it was your choice does not mean I have to like what it cost you. I looked at him and suddenly understood what frightened me most. It was not losing the magical connection. It was discovering how much I missed being heard by him. Damien seemed to understand anyway. He placed the writing pad back in my hands and said quietly, "Then we learn another way." For the first time, he could not hear my answer. Yet when I smiled, he smiled back. The strangest thing about losing the connection was discovering how quickly Damien adapted to its absence. By the next morning, there were writing pads in every room I regularly used. By the second day, he had learned to recognize several of my expressions before I could reach for a pencil. By the third, I was beginning to suspect he had never needed magic to understand me as much as I thought. The political crisis continued fading as evidence from the independent review reached the provinces. Without the decisions that had destroyed Damien in the story I remembered, the accusations against him had nothing solid to stand on. Caldwell's remaining influence disappeared quietly under public scrutiny, and the council began correcting the policies that had once pushed the empire toward disaster. The ending I knew was gone. There was no dramatic moment when the world announced that we had won. Life simply continued in a direction the novel had never written. A week after the bond disappeared, Damien and I returned to the old library. The silver mark around my throat had faded almost completely. I opened the book that had warned us about the curse and found something we had missed. Beneath the description of the silent witness was a final line written in nearly invisible ink. When the assigned bond is willingly rejected, silence remains only until the witness chooses his own voice. I stared at the sentence. Damien read it beside me. "Chooses his own voice," he said. I touched my throat. For the first time since breaking the sequence, I felt something other than emptiness there. I tried to speak, but only a faint breath escaped. Damien did not look disappointed. "Do not force it. Easy for you to say," I wrote. "You have been talking this entire time. Mostly because someone has to compensate for your personality." I stared at him in outrage. Damien smiled and returned the book to the table. Over the next several days, tiny sounds returned. A breath became a whisper. A whisper became a broken syllable. Damien never asked me to demonstrate my progress. Somehow that mattered. My voice was no longer something a curse had taken or an emperor needed. It belonged to me. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the council crisis, I found Damien standing alone near the palace garden doors. Sunset stretched across the windows while he read another stack of reports. He looked tired, but peaceful in a way I had never seen in the early days. I approached quietly. He noticed me and set the papers aside. "You should be resting." I rolled my eyes. "Yes, I recognize that expression now." He turned toward the corridor. Something inside me suddenly resisted watching him walk away. For weeks, Damien had heard everything I never meant to say. My complaints, my fears, my secrets. He had heard the thoughts I could not control, but there was one thing he had never heard. Something I could finally choose to give him. I drew a careful breath. "Damien." He stopped. The sound was rough and quiet, barely more than a whisper, but it was my voice. Damien turned slowly. For several seconds, he simply stared at me. Then his expression softened into the warmest smile I had ever seen from him. "Noah." I laughed, and even that small sound felt extraordinary. "You heard me." My voice trembled, but the words came. Damien stepped closer, stopping at the familiar, respectful distance. "I always did." I shook my head. "Not like this." He understood. Of course he did. I looked toward the garden, suddenly nervous despite everything we had survived. I spent so long thinking I was trapped in someone else's story. Damien waited. "But I do not want the old ending. I do not want the life somebody planned for me." I met his eyes. "I want this one. I want to stay. And I want to stay with you." Damien did not need magic to hear what I meant. "Then stay," he said softly. For the first time, There was no curse carrying my thoughts to him, no novel telling us what happened next, and no predetermined ending waiting ahead. There was only my voice, his answer, and a future neither of us had read before.